The nature of free will. The world believes there is a conflict or a contradiction between mankind's free will and the omniscience of God. However, if we had no free will, we would lack responsibility, and this would mean God is responsible for evil. Does the need hold people responsible for what they do mean God cannot have the attributes God must have to exist? It is not a question of whether or not people have free will. Christians cannot believe otherwise. The question is whether God exists. The conclusion made by many atheists, that free will and an all-powerful God are contradictory ideas, means atheists do not understand the concepts. Yet, the argument is so persuasive, some Christians have concluded that salvation is predestined. Predestination is the idea we have no choice as to whether we are saved or not. Our prayers of repentance are pointless. We are saved regardless of what we do. In this regard, free will is sacrificed to the omniscience of God. But the downside to predestination and irresistible grace is that individual responsibility no longer exists. If the issue is one or the other, then God's power and man's free will are indeed incompatible positions. If God is not all-powerful, he does not exist, so predestination may be the best choice if a choice is needed. If pushed to make a choice, this would be the option adopted by most Christians. God is omnipotent and infinitely good, so if he predestines the chosen to be saved, his will be done. God must know who will be saved or not. It is easy to see that rejecting God's omniscience is a bad idea. It is harder to see that rejecting the free will of human beings is not as problematical. A lack of free will is, however, easier for atheists and those who believe in a causal universe to accept. Most liberals prefer to think of evil as a disease to be treated by compassion and psychotropic drugs. But this does not make it the preferred option. Predestination and causality equally conflict with the necessity of holding people responsible for their actions, otherwise maturity is not possible. Consequently, Christians are faced with a conundrum that has not had an easy answer. Subscribing total omniscience to God appears to make him culpable for mankind's fall and every evil done. On the other hand, by insisting mankind needs free will to be responsible for the wrongs he does, we seem to deprive God of his absolute power. This essay takes the view that, if we want to understand and resolve this issue, we must look at the concepts used. We have to look at their meaning. Why is God's power and man's fall defined in incompatible ways? God is not limited in his power, so he is not contained in or by human logic. That God's omniscience appears to create a paradox as a consequence of how we think about reality. There is no logical necessity for mankind to question either God's existence or his nature. But since we do question these things, we first ought to ask what is free will that it produces doubt. We know doubt originated in the Garden of Eden. Satan is not concerned with God's omniscience. The issue is not really about whether God is all-knowing or all-powerful. What is at issue is God's legitimacy. He has power, one cannot deny this, but is the power legitimate? Is the power of God used in a legitimate or justified way? If Satan can bring into question God's legitimacy and the legitimacy of his power, then he calls into question God's position and authority. If the power of God is not legitimate, then rebellion is justified. Indeed, resolving the free will issue would not help resolve the issue of God's legitimacy. Free will is as problematical for evolutionists as for Christians. But we assume that whatever power nature has, it is justified. Satan knows that once we see God as imperfect, his legitimacy is called into question. God is such that if he is not perfect, his existence is called into question. God to be God must be perfect, for that is the only state in which he can exist as God. This is a situation God ordained. If a person cannot accept God as perfect, he will not accept God exists. It is important, therefore, for Satan to throw doubt on God's right to be God. It is why atheists' main arguments against God all center on their claim that God is not as God ought to be. They argue that God falls short of his necessary attributes. This attack against God's legitimacy is what the infamous Euclidean paradox is all about. It is vitally important that apologists demonstrate that God is fully and wholly God. His authority is legitimate because the character of God is unimpeachable. If God is considered the way we think of absolutism, it is obvious an autocrat is not fully in control if there are activities happening that do not align with the objectives of the state. But God is not man and certainly not comparable to a human dictator. The fact that people sin does not mean God controls their sin or is unable to stop the sin. We know God cannot tolerate sin or be in the presence of that which is not perfect. This is a dilemma that God overcame with the sacrifice of Jesus. God created reality, but this means we have a problem with understanding how sin and evil came into being. We assume the existence of evil means God created the reality of flesh and sin. But this is not God's creation nor an actual creation. God created Eden. It is a garden in that Eden was made for man. The world of the flesh parallel creation made by the sin of man. This false reality is what we inhabit as sinners. It is why we must be reborn. We must transcend this corruption of Eden and reform Eden. Eden is lost in the past, but it is possible to recreate it by a reformation of the corruption we inherited as fallen man. The conclusion is therefore that two realities exist, one created by God and the other created by disobedience. God is fully aware of what goes on in His creation despite there being free will, because all of creation seeks to do His will. In His will we are being perfected. Imagine God's reality as truth and logic and total, unblemished morality. Everything is predictable because perfection permits only one possible result. It is when we diverge from perfection, from the absolute good, that we sin, do evil, and our actions are no longer predictable. But they are also outside of God's province and so no longer acting freely. We have free will that cannot be contested. But free will is not what many suppose it to be. Free will does not neutralize gravity nor produce unique solutions to mathematical problems. That is why we can fail an exam. There are right answers to questions. We can come to wrong answers and wrong conclusions, but this is not done out of free will, because if we are doing things by means of will, we are coming to the truth, we would not be destroying it. This then leads to the question of whether free will is even free. Does the expression make sense? We are free to go in any direction we wish, but if we wish to go to the store, there is only one place we can go to. Regardless of what you think free will is, there are right answers to mankind's problems. What other freedom is, and regardless of what other freedoms we think we have, the only other freedom than to do what is right, is to be wrong. What is more predictable than the person who endeavors to do the right thing? What is less predictable than those who are evil? Free will, in the way liberals think of it, is nothing more than an ability to make mistakes. But what does this capacity to err consist of? If we have the choice to do the right thing, what divides doing what is right from doing what is wrong? This might seem to be a question impossible to answer. We think the answer will be different depending on who answers. But we are not the measure of right and wrong, and if we are all coming to different answers, we are all coming to the wrong one. Christians accept that the universe was made by God, but this is not the physical, visible one. If one does not understand the nature of creation and the teachings about the world of the flesh and the world of the spirit, one will be confounded by the existence of sin and an omniscient God. The world of the flesh is a universe made of a substance that to us seems objectively real. This is why Adam and Eve covered their nakedness with fig leaves, to illustrate the realness of physical reality. Reality is composed of truth. Truth is not physical. When we lie, we deconstruct reality. When we do evil, we destroy the reality of truth. Reality is as a garden. When we do the right thing, we enhance it. Doing right is doing that which adds value to the things God created. The central question is what it means to add value. We can assume that the opposite of adding value is damage and destruction. Doing evil limits or hinders the usefulness of assets because it destroys what these things or ideas really are. Evil destroys truth because it destroys the reality that is created by the truths of God. It's not difficult to see the difference between making something more useful and making it unusable or less usable. The difference is as easy to illustrate as putting water in a glass, then dropping mud into it. In the context of free will, why would we damage resources or hurt other people? It seems irrational, and it is. That is the point. People do not do things that are wrong out of an exercise of free will. they become compelled to hurt others. However, doing evil